The Lands Between is not a place that was designed to frighten you, and that is exactly what makes it frightening. There is a version of Elden Ring that most people play, and then there is the version that exists underneath it, in the margins of item descriptions, and in the geometry of spaces that were never meant to be inhabited for long. I spent a significant amount of time putting this video together, and I want to be honest with you early on about a few choices I made along the way. I emphasized atmospheric dread over raw shock value, wherever the two pulled in different directions, which means some of the more surface level horror, the jump scares, and the dramatic boss deaths are largely absent here. What I kept was the kind of material that unsettled me when I found it, not because it was violent or grotesque in an obvious way, but because it suggested something about the world of Elden Ring that the game itself never quite says aloud. I also made a deliberate choice to hold certain threads until late in the video, because a few of the stories here only become genuinely disturbing once you understand what surrounds them. If that sounds like the kind of thing you want to sit with for a while, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1. The ones who are left behind the Lands Between is full of the dead, and most of them are unremarkable in their dying. You find them in collapsed towers and at the edges of cliffs and slumped against the roots of ancient trees. And after a few hours in the game, you stop registering them as individuals. That is the first thing worth saying about Elden Ring's horror. Not a specific story yet, just an observation about the texture of the world. The game trains you to stop paying attention. It does this deliberately, and the evidence for that claim is everywhere once you start looking for it. The sheer density of death in the Lands Between functions as a kind of perceptual noise, and what gets hidden in perceptual noise is always the thing that was meant to be found only by the patient ones. The wandering nobles are as good a place to start as any. They shamble through Limgrave in the early zones in their rusted armor, and most players kill them by the dozens without ever reading what their equipment actually says. The armor of a wandering noble describes individuals who set out from their homelands to make the pilgrimage to the Erd Tree, drawn by faith and by the promise of grace, and who simply never arrived. They did not die in battle. They did not fall to a monster. They wandered until something inside them gave out, until whatever sense of self had animated the journey dissolved, and then they kept moving anyway. The horror in that is not theatrical. It does not announce itself with music or with dramatic lighting. It is just there, in a 12-word item description attached to an enemy you killed without a second thought. That quiet mode of horror is the one this video is most interested in. There are stories in Elden Ring that are frightening in the way a nightmare is frightening, full of imagery and violence and wrongness of shape, and we will get to those. But the ones that have stayed with me the longest are the ones that work the way the Wandering Noble works, through implication and through the gap between what the game shows you and what you have to supply yourself. That gap is where the genuine dread lives. The Erd Tree itself is worth examining early because it casts its shadow over so much of what follows. It is the defining visual of Elden Ring, the golden tree that dominates every skyline. The thing toward which every road in the Lands Between seems, at some angle, to be pointed. Players spend the entire game approaching it, and when they finally arrive, the thing they find is not a source of warmth or divinity, but a burning pyre and a door. The Erd Tree rejected the Tarnished once before. It sealed its gates. It turned away the dead and the graced alike. And it did this not because it had been damaged or corrupted in a simple sense, but because something at its root had already gone wrong long before the shattering. Marika's act of destroying the Elden Ring was not an impulsive one. The lore makes this gradually and quietly clear. Not through any single revelation, but through the accumulated weight of what you find in places like the Erd Tree Sanctuary, and in the words of figures like Enya and Renala. Marika had been watching for a very long time. She had been collecting, through the murders of her Empyrean rivals, and through the political architecture of the Golden Order, The conditions for a break she had been planning across centuries. The horror in that is the horror of something that was always going to happen. The shattering was not a catastrophe that befell the lands between. It was a choice made by the person who was supposed to be its god, and it was made in full knowledge of what would follow. What that means for the wandering nobles is something the game never states, but which becomes hard to ignore once you hold it in mind. These are people who gave up their lives to reach a god who had already decided, at some level, that the world she governed was not worth preserving. They are pilgrims on a road that leads to an act of divine abandonment. The faith that animated their journey was not misplaced in the ordinary sense of faith that turns out to be wrong. It was misplaced in a more particular way, because the object of that faith was itself in the process of unbelieving. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the minor Erd trees scattered across the lands between, and notice that each of them is attended by an Erd tree avatar. A guardian that attacks without provocation and that drops, on death, a sacred tear used to strengthen healing. The avatars are not corrupted entities. They are not enemies in the sense of things that have turned against their purpose. They are doing exactly what they were made to do, protecting the sources of grace with a violence that was always part of their design. The grace that heals you was always defended by something that would kill you to prevent you reaching it. The Erd Tree burial watchdogs complicate this further. They are stone constructs, ancient and methodical, and they guard the catacombs where the dead are interred. Their item description specifies that they were created to watch over the resting places of heroes and to guide the worthy toward the grace of the Erd Tree. They do this now in a world where the Erd Tree has closed itself, where grace has become something strange and contested, and where the catacombs they guard have, in many cases, been sealed from the inside by their own inhabitants. They are still guarding. They still believe in the function they were built to perform, regardless of whether the system that function served still operates in any coherent way. That image, something continuing to perform its sacred duty after the sacred order has collapsed, appears more often in Elden Ring than in almost any other From Software game. And it is one of the quietest sources of dread in the whole work. It suggests a world in which devotion outlasts its object, in which the structures of faith and service persist as hollow forms after the substance that gave them meaning has departed. The wandering noble is still walking toward the Erd Tree. The Erd Tree avatar is still guarding what the Erd Tree no longer distributes freely. The burial watchdog is still turning away the unworthy from a grace that no longer reliably comes. The frenzied flame prescription is one of the places in Elden Ring where the horror becomes more explicit, but it earns its explicitness through the setup that precedes it. To reach the frenzied flame, you have to descend through the subterranean shunning grounds beneath Lindell. And the shunning grounds are one of the game's most deliberately unpleasant spaces. The sewer architecture is ancient, and it is inhabited by Omen, the horned figures who were cast down from the city above, driven underground not because of any crime they committed, but because their bodies carried a power that the Golden Order considered impure. The Omen are not monsters in the sense of things that were transformed into wrongness. They were born this way, and they were cast into the dark for it. Morgott, who is the boss of Lindell proper, is an Omen. He is also, simultaneously, the gracious hand of the Erd Tree, the figure who has spent his entire existence defending the very order that condemned him for being what he is. The horror in Morgott is not in his boss fight, though that fight is one of the game's best. It is in the lore that surrounds him, and the fact that he has chosen service to a system that despises him, and that this service is genuine. He is not performing loyalty under duress. He believes, and his belief is the most disturbing thing about him. Mog, who is Morgott's brother and his opposite, found a different answer to the same problem. Cast into the shunning grounds, he encountered the Formless Mother, a figure of outer blood and frenzied devotion, and was offered a power that the Golden Order could not contain or classify. Mog's horror is more legible than Morgott's in some ways, the blood magic. The dynasty built on stolen and unconscious children, the underground palace assembled from suffering. But it is also easier to dismiss. Morgoth's horror requires you to take his devotion seriously, which is harder work. Deep beneath the shunning grounds, behind a door that requires you to remove all your clothing to open it, is the Three Fingers. The door's requirement is not arbitrary. It is the game telling you that you have to come to this encounter without armor or protection or the social identity that equipment represents. You come as a body, and the Three Fingers receives you as a body, marking you with the flame of frenzy and setting you on the path toward burning everything. The god of chaos wants you naked, because it wants to reach the thing underneath the role you have been playing. That detail, the stripped body and the mark, points towards something the game returns to repeatedly in its treatment of the Frenzied Flame. The Lord of Frenzied Flame ending, which most players consider the game's bad ending, does not present itself as villainy. It presents itself as a logic, one that Hayeta articulates across her questline, with a clarity and a sorrow that make it hard to dismiss. The Frenzied Flame holds that all life is suffering, that the separation of self from self is the source of that suffering, and that the only genuine mercy is dissolution, the erasure of individuality back into the undifferentiated warmth from which all things came. Hayeta believes this. She moves toward the Three Fingers willingly, and she does so because she has thought about it, not because she has been deceived. The horror of the Frenzied Flame is not that it is wrong. It is that it might be right about the nature of the lands between and wrong about the prescription, or right about both and simply too large a cost, or that there is no clean way to adjudicate between these possibilities from inside the world where the question arises. The game does not resolve this. It gives you Hayeta's questline and Millicent's questline in the ending slides, and it lets the discomfort sit. The ending slides for the Lord of Frenzied Flame ending describe the incineration of the Erdtree, the burning of the Golden Order's last symbol, and a world that has been emptied. And then they describe something returning, slowly, which is either a horror or a hope depending on what you think the world was worth. That ambiguity is deliberate, and it is one of the reasons Elden Ring's horror holds up under repeated examination in a way that more resolved horror often does not. A story that tells you what to think about what it has shown you flatters the audience. A story that shows you something and stands back requires more of you, and the requirement is part of what makes it stay. The Lands Between keeps its horror in the places where you have to do some of the work yourself. Chapter 2. What the roots carry the Erdtree's roots are everywhere, and most players treat them as scenery. They emerge from the ground throughout Limgrave and Liurnia. They cradle the ruins of structures that predate the Golden Order, and in certain places they have grown through the walls of buildings, in ways that look less like nature and more like possession. The visual grammar of roots in Elden Ring is doing something deliberate, and the thing it is doing does not become fully clear until you start reading about what lives beneath the Erdtree, and what the Erdtree is, at its core, built upon. The Erdtree is not native to the Lands Between. This is one of the pieces of lore that the game delivers quietly and without fanfare, through the Elden Star's incantation, and through the scattered references to the Greater Will and its envoys. The Erdtree was planted. It was introduced into the Lands Between by a cosmic force that the game calls the Greater Will, and that introduction reshaped the metaphysics of the world it entered. Before the Erdtree, something else governed the cycle of life and death in the Lands Between, and that something else is still present, underground, in the roots, in the deep-root depths, where the Erdtree's physical foundation extends into something much older. The Elden Beast, which is the final boss of the standard endings, is the Erdtree's animating intelligence. It is an outer god housed within the Golden Tree, and it fights you with the conviction of something that genuinely cannot conceive of its own defeat. What is disturbing about the Elden Beast is less its design than its implication. The entity that you have been moving toward across the entire game, the thing at the center of the Lands Between spiritual life, the source of grace and of the cycles that govern life and death, is an alien intelligence from outside the world entirely. The grace it distributes is real, but it serves a purpose that has nothing to do with the welfare of the people it chose. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Crucible Knight enemies, and notice that their armor describes the Crucible as the primordial state of all life and the lands between, a churning mix of aspects and forms from which the distinct shapes of living things gradually crystallized. The Crucible Knights are devoted to this primordial state, and the Erd Tree's Golden Order, with its hierarchy of grace and its exclusion of the unworthy, represents something like its opposite, a cosmology of fixity and purity imposed over a world that was originally characterized by fluidity and mixture. The Golden Order did not build on neutral ground. It displaced something. What that displaced thing was is one of the most productive uncertainties in all of Elden Ring's lore. The crucible aspects, the ancient dragons, the primeval current of Farum Azula, the serpent worship that the Golden Order labored to suppress. All of these suggest a world before the Erd Tree that was not simply primitive or disordered, but differently ordered, governed by logics that the Greater Will's arrival interrupted without erasing. The horror in this is the horror of a palimpsest, a document written over another document, with the original still visible in places if you know where to look and how to tilt the light. The Deeproot Depths is where the palimpsest becomes most visible. You reach it through the subterranean shunning grounds, past the Omen, past the Three Fingers, down through layers of the city's buried history. And what you find is a vast cavern under the Erd Tree, where the roots descend and where something vast and ancient is dying. Fia, the deathbed companion, is there. She has been there, holding the rune of death that she took from the twinned knight Roger passed his knowledge to, nursing a plan to restore the rune of death to the world and break the Erd Tree's hold on the cycle of life. Her questline is one of the game's most carefully constructed, and its horror is quiet in the way that the best of Elden Ring's horror tends to be. The rune of death was removed from the Elden Ring by Marika herself at the instruction of the Greater Will. The removal of death, meaning true and permanent death, from the lands between was one of the Golden Order's foundational acts. Under the Erd Tree's grace, the dead could be guided back through the cycle, reborn or sustained as undead, and the finality of ending was replaced by a managed continuity. This sounds like mercy, and it was presented as mercy, and it is possible to read it as genuinely merciful. It is also possible to read it as the removal of the one thing that gave life in the lands between its meaning, which is the thing that Fia and the gloam-eyed queen before her, and the assassins of the Black Knife before that, all seem to believe. The Black Knife assassins murdered Godwyn the Golden on the Night of Black Knives, using stolen shards of the Rune of Death. They killed only his soul, not his body, which is the specific horror that produced the Prince of Death situation in the Deeproot Depths. Godwyn's body is still there, still growing, still animated by something, spreading through the roots of the Erd Tree in a form of existence that the game's language consistently treats as wrong. A corruption, a rot, an inversion of the grace the Erd Tree is supposed to represent. The death root that spreads through the Deeproot Depths, and that D, Hunter of the Dead. And Garank consume or hunt is Godwyn's spreading undeath. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the location of Godwyn's body within the Deeproot Depths, and notice that he is directly beneath the Erd Tree's heartwood. That the roots that carry death through the lands between are the same roots that carry the Erd Tree's grace outward. This is not accidental. The game is describing a system in which corruption and sanctity travel the same pathways, in which the distribution network for divine grace is also the distribution network for divine rot. The Erd Tree does not have a clean version and a corrupted version that you can separate from each other. The rot is in the roots. This detail resonates outward through the entire lore in ways that take multiple playthroughs to fully register. Every site of grace is a point of connection to the Erd Tree's root network. Every moment of healing and guidance you receive in the game is delivered through a system that is also delivering the spread of Godwyn's undeath. The grace that sustains the tarnished on their journey is traveling the same channels as the death blight that kills them in the Deeproot depths. You are using the same infrastructure as the rot, and the game never draws your attention to this directly. The Crucible Knight lore opens up another angle on this. The Crucible, as a concept, represents not only the primordial state of life, but also the specific mixing of forms that the Erdtree's order suppressed. The Omen, who carry crucible aspects in their horns and their bodies, were cast underground in part because their physical form represented a refusal of the Golden Order's taxonomy. They were living proof that the older, more fluid cosmology had not been fully erased, and the Golden Order could not tolerate that proof above ground, where it might be interpreted as legitimate. The underground is where the Golden Order put everything it could not incorporate. The fire giant at the mountaintops of the giants is the last of his kind, the survivor of a people that were nearly exterminated by Marika's armies in the campaign to secure the Flame of Ruin. He is chained. He has been chained for an age by a decree that required him to survive, so that someone at the end of things could come and kill him and use his burning to access the Forge of Giants and burn the Erdtree. Marika needed the Fire Giants people destroyed, but she could not destroy all of them, because she needed one left to perform this specific function at the end of her plan. The last Fire Giant was not spared out of mercy. He was spared out of the same cold strategic logic that governed everything Marika did across the centuries of the Golden Order. That detail, a people nearly exterminated as a political prerequisite, and one survivor maintained as a tool, is not framed as a horror in the game's narrative. It is simply part of the world's history, noted in item descriptions and in the environmental storytelling of the mountaintops. The horror requires you to supply the emotional weight yourself, to sit with what it means for the fire giant to have been kept alive across an age and chains, alone on the highest peaks of the lands between, for no reason except to serve as a key to a door his imprisoned god needed opened. The mountaintops of the giants is one of the coldest spaces in Elden Ring, and not only because of the weather. The ruins of the giant culture are everywhere, their hearth symbols and their memorial stones, the evidence of a civilization that was fully formed before it was ended. And the game places these ruins in a location that is physically and aesthetically as far from the warmth of the Erdtree as anywhere in the world. The cold reads as a kind of commentary on what happened there. Some spaces in Elden Ring feel haunted. The mountaintops feel emptied. What roots carry, in the end, is whatever you put into the ground. The Erdtree's roots carry grace in death and rot and history, in the memory of a world that existed before them. The horror is not in any single thread, but in the system, in the way that the same infrastructure serves multiple purposes simultaneously, and cannot be cleanly divided into its sacred and its profane components. The lands between was built on compromises and concealments, and the roots remember all of them, whether or not the people walking above them do. Chapter 3. The Makers and the Made There is a specific kind of horror in Elden Ring that belongs to the things that were created rather than born. The Crucible predates the Golden Order, and so does the practice of making things from other things. But the Golden Order refined this practice and gave it a particular character, and the products of that refinement are among the most unsettling presences in the game. The crafted and the constructed occupy a strange position in Elden Ring's moral and cosmological architecture, because the game is consistently interested in the question of what it costs to make something. Not in the material sense, but in the more fundamental sense of what has to be done to living, or once living matter, to shape it into something useful. The Elden Ring Finger Maidens are the most immediately visible example of this dynamic. The Finger Maidens serve the Two Fingers, the emissaries of the Greater Will, and they are described in ways that suggest their role was not chosen. They are dedicated, the language says. They are committed to their function. But the lore surrounding the Two Fingers, the fact that the Two Fingers themselves are described as servants that were dispatched to the lands between by the Greater Will, suggests a hierarchy of creation and service that extends from the cosmic level down to the individual figure of a young woman who exists to guide a tarnished she will never fully understand. The maiden's dedication to a function she did not design for herself is the structure of the entire Lands Between in miniature. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the finger maiden Therlina and notice that she has been dead for some time when you find her, killed by Kenneth Height's summons going wrong, and that her body is still present as an item in the world, harvestable for crafting. The game uses her in the economy of materials and preparation in exactly the way it uses any other resource. She is a person with a specific function and a name and a history, and she is also in the game's systems a source of materials. That tension between personhood and utility is not unique to Therlina, but she is one of the places where it becomes most visible. The Albinaurics represent a more deliberate version of this tension. They were created, a fact the game establishes clearly through the lore of Liurnia in the village in the southwest of the lake. The first generation of Albinaurics were made from a process involving the Amber Egg, shaped by a craftsman named Kyoarin under the patronage of the Academy of Raya Lucaria. They were made to be human adjacent, capable of accumulating grace and of performing the functions of human servants, without being fully human in the sense that the Golden Order recognized. The second generation, the ones who move on their hands and carry pots on their feet, are described as failed, as a degraded iteration of the original design, creatures who were made wrong in a process that the Academy apparently continued running regardless. The village of the Albinaurics is one of the locations in Elden Ring that the horror settles into most completely. The village has been attacked. The inhabitants, those who survived, have sealed themselves in their homes or fled. The items you find there describe a community that was fully realized, with its own social structures and its own relationship to grace and to the Erd Tree. And that was destroyed not as a consequence of the Shattering's wider violence, but as a specific targeted act. Someone came to the village of the Albinaurics to kill Albinaurics in particular. And the evidence for who and why is scattered through the Mogwin Palace lore in the descriptions of the items you find on the bodies. The horror here is the horror of a pogrom, which is not a word the game uses, but which the evidence describes with some precision. The Albinaurics were considered not fully real by the Golden Order, and that assessment of their status made them available as targets in ways that the Golden Order's formally recognized persons were not. The fact that they were made rather than born may have been part of what denied them standing. If your existence is the product of a craftsman's decision rather than the natural process the Golden Order sanctioned, you may be more property than person in the cosmological accounting, and property can be disposed of. Latina the Albinauric's questline moves through this history with a restraint that makes it more affecting than a more dramatic treatment would have been. She is carrying a secret, the location of the Haligtree Medallion's other half, and she is trying to reach Millennia. She is also one of the last of her kind in any organized sense, aware that the world has already decided what she is worth and choosing to act within it anyway. Her wolf Lobo, who is dead and whose body she is still carrying when you find her, is a detail the game drops quietly, in the image of the Albinauric woman being pulled across the world on the back of a dead wolf, toward a destination she can only reach with help, is the kind of image that does not announce its weight, but carries it regardless. The marionette soldiers of Liurnia are another form of the made creature horror, though their mode is different. They are the reanimated corpses of Academy soldiers, repurposed after death as guards and combatants by the sorcery of Raya Lucaria. They move in the specific wrong way of things that were built to move, rather than things that learned to. The lore does not give them interiority. They are presented as constructs, which means their horror is environmental rather than personal. They are a statement about what the Academy considered acceptable, about a culture of scholarship that was comfortable making soldiers out of the dead, because the dead were otherwise not doing anything useful. The Golem Archers and the Erd Tree Sentinels belong to a slightly different category, constructs built rather than reassembled. And their horror is in their fidelity rather than their wrongness. They are still performing their function. They are still guarding the approaches to the Erdtree, still blocking the passage of anyone without the proper grace, still operating according to instructions given in a world that no longer exists in the form those instructions presupposed. The horror of the faithful construct, the thing that continues because it was built to continue, and because continuation is the only mode it has, is quieter than the horror of the repurposed corpse, but it lasts longer. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the ancient hero of Zamor, and notice that the name suggests an individual, a specific person with a history and a cultural origin, who has been preserved and repurposed as a boss encounter. The Zamor culture is one of the game's vanished civilizations, associated with ice and with a warrior tradition that predates the Golden Order. An ancient hero of Zamor exists in a similar position to the fire giant, a survivor or remnant of something that was ended, but without even the chain that gives the fire giant a narrative function. The ancient hero of Zamor is just there, in a ruin, still fighting, for reasons the game does not supply, and perhaps does not have. The grafted creatures, the omens, and the various experiments of the Academy and of Caelid all participate in this same question about what it costs to make something from something else. The grafted scions, which are among the first enemies many players encounter, are described as failures, as things assembled from too many human components and then discarded. They move in the way that things move when their parts do not agree about direction. They are the waste products of a process the game never fully explains, present in the world as evidence of work that was done without sufficient care for what the work produced. The horror of the maker and the made is ultimately the horror of a world in which the distinction between person and resource was never stable, in which the same hands that built the Golden Order's structures of grace and hierarchy were also assembling things from the people those structures were supposed to protect. The lands between is full of things that were made from people, and full of people who were treated as things to be made from, and the game holds both of these facts in the same frame, without resolving the tension between them. What is being said here, in the accumulated weight of all these details, is that creation in the lands between was never innocent. Every constructed thing carries the history of what it was constructed from, and the refusal to look at that history is itself one of the things the game is interested in examining. Chapter 4. The children of broken gods, the demigods of Elden Ring, are not tragic in the way that the word tragic is usually applied. Tragedy, in its classical sense, implies a greatness that was undone by a flaw or by fate. A fall from height to depth that carries some sense of what was lost. The children of Marika and Radagon do not quite fit this model, though the game invites you to read them that way at certain moments. What they are, more precisely, is the products of a specific kind of damage. Children who were shaped by the expectations and the plans of parents who were not operating in good faith, and who then shattered, as the Elden Ring shattered, into pieces that the world was not built to contain. Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy, is the one who is most often read as a horror story in the straightforward sense, and the reading is not wrong. He had himself devoured by the serpent deity Rykard had offered himself to, in an act that his followers describe as transcendence, and that the game's framing suggests was more complicated than transcendence. The result is a boss that is half deity and half digested human intelligence, still present, still speaking, still offering the communion of being eaten to anyone who comes to challenge him. The horror of Rykard is visceral and architectural, the vast snake-bodied thing in its pit of blood, the skeletal figures ranged along the walls, the voice that sounds like someone who made a decision they cannot fully regret, because regret would require acknowledging that it was a mistake. But the horror that interests me more is the one underneath the Rykard encounter, which is the question of what Rykard was before he made his choice. He was one of Marika's children, raised in the Golden Order, shaped by the expectations of divine lineage and political inheritance. He turned against the Golden Order and founded Volcano Manor as an act of deliberate transgression, which means he was a person who thought carefully about what he was doing and did it anyway. The blasphemy was not an accident or a corruption. It was a position. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the quest lines of the Volcano Manor assassins and notice that the targets they send you after are almost exclusively individuals who are trying to do something within the existing order, lords who are maintaining their positions, champions who have not yet broken. The Manor's mission is not simply violence. It is the undermining of the structures that the Golden Order depends upon, carried out through a network of killers who have all made their own particular peace with transgression. Rykard built something. It is a horror show, but it has a consistent philosophy. Millennia, Blade of Miquella, is the child of Marika, who generates the most pure aesthetic horror in the game, and also the one whose horror is most clearly the product of circumstances she did not choose. She was born with the Scarlet Rot as a curse, a divine affliction that her body is constantly generating, and that she can only manage, never eliminate. Every time she has pushed herself to the limit in battle, the rot has bloomed, and in the fight at Caelid that ended in a draw with Radon, it bloomed catastrophically enough to transform the entire region into a blighted wasteland. Millennia did not choose to do this. She was fighting for her brother. The rot flower that Millennia becomes in her second phase is one of the game's most visually striking horror images. A golden figure erupting into petals and disease simultaneously. Beautiful and terrible in the way that the game's visual language often tries for, but rarely achieves as completely as here. What makes it genuinely disturbing rather than just impressive is the context. This is what fighting for the person you love costs, and the lands between. This is what devotion produces in a world where devotion is governed by the same logic as everything else, which is that the forces involved do not care about the costs to the individual carrying them. Miquella, who is Millennia's twin and the one she was fighting to protect, is one of the game's central mysteries and one of its most sustained horror stories. He was the most gifted of all the Empyreans, capable of developing incantations outside the doctrine of the two fingers, capable of crafting unalloyed gold that could neutralize the influence of the outer gods. He was also cursed with eternal youth, trapped in a child's body, unable to grow regardless of the centuries he accumulated. His response to this curse was to build the Halleck tree, a tree he grew from his own flesh to create an alternative to the Erd tree, a sanctuary for those the Golden Order excluded. The Halleck tree was his gift to the rejected, including his sister. He never finished it. He put himself into a cocoon within the Halleck tree's heart to complete the process of growing beyond the curse, and while he slept, Mohg found him and stole him. Mohg, whose own underground imprisonment had given him both madness and the patronage of the Formless Mother, carried Miquella away to the Mohgwyn dynasty mausoleum, and began a ritual to make Miquella into his consort, his chosen god for a new dynasty built on blood. The image of the child god in the cocoon, still sleeping, still being held against his will in the arms of the uncle who is trying to reshape him for a purpose he did not consent to, is not one the game dwells on or underlines. It is just there, in the mausoleum's boss arena, a detail in the background of a fight about something else. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the followers of Miquella, who appear in the Halleck tree and the lore surrounding them, and notice that Miquella's power included a specific and disturbing quality, the capacity to instill devotion. The item descriptions around Miquella suggest that the love his followers felt for him was not entirely natural, that it was shaped or amplified by something in his nature or his power, and that he may not have fully understood or controlled this. The people waiting for him at the Halleck tree waited across an age. The devotion that kept them there was real, but its origins are not straightforwardly voluntary. and the game holds that ambiguity without resolving it. Godric the Grafted is the demigod who most explicitly embodies the horror of the made from parts, and his personal history adds a dimension to his visual monstrousness that the fight alone does not communicate. He is the least of the demigods by bloodline, distant from Mariko's direct line, and he has spent his existence compensating for this insufficiency through grafting, through adding the limbs and bodies of the defeated to his own frame in an attempt to accumulate the power that lineage did not provide. The Stormveil throne room is full of the evidence of this process: incomplete grafted bodies, architectural arrangements of human remains that have not yet been incorporated. The horror of Godric is the horror of inadequacy made violent, of someone who understood exactly what the Golden Order valued and exactly what he lacked of it, and chose the most literal possible response. He is attaching bodies to himself because he has understood on some level that worth in the lands between is measured in power, and that power can be accumulated through acts of horrifying assembly. He is doing what the system around him taught him was the nature of achievement, and the result is a creature that embodies everything wrong with that system, while still being, in its own terms, a coherent response to the world it grew up in. Rennala, Queen of the Full Moon, is the demigod who is neither monstrous nor villainous in any straightforward sense, and her presence in the game is one of its more thoughtful pieces of horror writing. She was the head of the Academy of Raya Lucaria, a scholar and a ruler and a person who had built something genuinely impressive, who then married Radagon, and was effectively absorbed into the Golden Order's expansion, and then abandoned when Radagon was called back to become Marika's other half. The abandonment broke her. She is found in the Raya Lucaria library, cradling a golden egg, surrounded by the students she has enchanted into servitude, singing softly in a room that has been sealed from the inside. The horror of Rennala is in the gap between what she was and what she is. A gap produced by an abandonment that the Golden Order's logic required, and that she had no way to survive intact. The students who serve her now are not willing servants. They were enchanted, caught in the radius of a grief so large it restructured their agency. And Rennala herself, in her second phase, is still fighting with the tools of a scholar, still calling down the moon, still operating according to the logic of a world that has not been true for a long time. She is a person who did not receive the break she needed, and what filled the space where the break should have been is something the game presents as tragedy, but which also reads, at certain angles, as horror. The children of broken gods inherit the breaking. That is the quietest thing the demigod storylines say collectively, across all their variation and violence. Marika's fracture produced children who fractured, and forms specific to each of them, along the lines of the pressures they were placed under. The shattering was not a political event that damaged a stable world. It was the culmination of a process that had been running through the family for longer than the game's explicit timeline makes clear. Chapter 5. The things that should not persist, some things in the lands between, have simply been going on for too long. Not in a specific numerical sense, though the timescales involved are genuinely extreme, but in the more immediate sense that the thing you encounter in a dungeon, or at the edge of a lake, or in the depths of a ruin, has clearly passed through some threshold of duration, beyond which its continued existence represents a failure of the natural order to do its work. These are the horror stories that operate through the logic of wrongness of persistence, of something that should have ended and did not, of a process that continues because it was built to continue, and because no one with the capacity to stop it has done so. The Tibia Mariner is a ghost operating a boat and collecting bones. The lore on its equipment describes someone who served in a funerary tradition, guiding the dead to their rest, performing the navigational work of the afterlife. They are now an enemy, hostile to the living, summoning the dead against anyone who approaches. The transition from guide to threat is not explained in any single item description. but the accumulated lore suggests that a funerary tradition without a functioning afterlife to deliver its charges to becomes something strange and dangerous. A process with no valid destination still running, because it has no mechanism for stopping. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the death rites in the Deathbird enemies, and notice that both represent the same system in two different modes. The death rites as the formal ecclesiastical practice, and the Deathbirds as what that practice produces when it operates without oversight or destination. The Deathbirds are described as carrying death, but not in the sense of killing. They are carrying it in the logistical sense, moving it from place to place, because they were built to move it, and because the system that should have received it no longer functions. They are a postal service for death, in a world where death no longer has an address. The Crucible Knights, already discussed in the context of what came before the Erdtree, take on an additional dimension when considered through this lens. They are ancient in a way that most of the game's enemies are not. They predate the Golden Order they ended up serving, and they are still operating in full capacity, still performing their guardian function with the specific competence of things that were very good at what they were made to do. The horror is not in their capacity, but in their context. They are serving an order they are older than, having outlived whatever they were originally for, having accepted a new purpose, without any process of reflection visible in the lore. They simply continued, and when a new authority appeared, they served it. That flexibility is its own kind of horror. The capacity to persist by attaching to whatever structure presents itself, to replace one devotion with another without the seam showing. The Crucible Knights suggest a mode of existence that is not loyal to any specific thing, but is constitutively devoted, that needs a function to serve and will find one regardless of whether the function was ever genuinely worth serving. The ulcerated tree spirits are among the most purely, viscerally disturbing enemies in the game, and their lore deepens the visual horror, rather than explaining it away. They are described as spirits of the Erdtree, as something like the vital force of the divine tree that became trapped and ulcerated when Deathblight entered the root system. They are not corrupted from outside. They are the tree's own life force turned against itself, the animating energy of the world's central sacred site made into something that writhes in cave systems and attacks the living with the specific violence of a thing in constant pain. They are not malicious. They are agonized. That distinction, malice versus agony as the driver of horror, is one the game makes carefully and repeatedly. Very few of the genuinely disturbing things in Elden Ring are malicious in the simple sense of wanting harm. Most of them are operating according to logics that were reasonable at some point, in some context, under conditions that no longer apply. The ulcerated tree spirit is not trying to hurt you. It is suffering in the presence of something living. And the suffering expresses itself as violence, because suffering of sufficient intensity tends to. The Revenant enemies in Liurnia are a different variation on wrongness of persistence. They are the reanimated corpses of Numen, the same original people from which Marika descends, reanimated through the power of a finger snap that is somehow connected to the Two Fingers network. Their movement is wrong in the specific way that movement is wrong when the body performing it is not designed for the movement being required of it. They teleport in ways that defy the spatial logic the game otherwise maintains. They approach from directions that were unoccupied a moment before. They are present in a space and then present in a different space without the intervening process of travel. The horror of the Revenant is partly in their movement and partly in what their existence says about the Two Fingers' relationship to death. The Revenants are associated with the Fingers, and the suggestion in their item descriptions is that they serve as a kind of enforcement mechanism, bodies preserved and animated to carry out functions that require physical presence. They are the undead labor of a divine bureaucracy, and they are disturbing in the way that all unwilling labor is disturbing, but more so because the labor involves people who have no remaining capacity to consent or refuse. Another quiet detail appears when you look at Insha of the royal remains and notice that his set description suggests he was once a person of standing who was hollow and then filled with something else, something from the fingers, something that used the architecture of his former self as a vessel. He invades your world if you progress Fia's questline, suggesting that he is functioning as a monitoring system, a tripwire in service of the two fingers' interests, animated by a foreign purpose in a body that used to have its own. The personal history of Insha, the specificity of the armor's description, makes this worse rather than better. He was someone. The beastmen of Farum Azula are perhaps the clearest example in the game of things that should not persist, because the world they belong to has ceased to exist entirely. Farum Azula is a city suspended in a perpetual storm, slowly fragmenting, its stones drifting apart in an environment that defies the physics of everything below it. It exists outside of time in a way the game gestures toward but does not fully explain, caught in a moment that is somehow also ongoing, simultaneously fixed and falling. The beastmen who inhabit it are the survivors of a culture so old that the creatures they worshipped, the ancient dragons, predate the Erd Tree by cosmological eras. They are still there. They are still guarding a city that is falling apart around them, still practicing the customs of a civilization that has not had anyone else practicing those customs for longer than most of the game's timeline extends. The horror of the beastmen is the horror of the last congregation, the final practitioners of a tradition that has no transmission left, who continue because the tradition does not include the concept of stopping. They are not waiting for something. There is nothing to wait for. They are simply persisting because that is the mode they are in. The things that persist wrongly in the lands between are not uniformly monstrous. Some of them, like Renala and the Wandering Nobles and in some sense Morgoth, are recognizably pathetic in the original sense of the word, evoking a suffering that is real and that calls for a response other than simple fear. The game does not sort its horrors into neat categories of monster and victim. It places them in the same world, unless the distinctions work themselves out through attention and context. What should have ended and did not is a question that runs through the entire lands between. From the cosmic level of an outer god that should have finished its business with the world and moved on, to the individual level of a pilgrim who should have died properly and instead wanders, to the bureaucratic level of a funerary tradition that should have concluded when the thing it was delivering to stopped accepting deliveries. The persistence is systemic. It is not a series of isolated accidents. It is what happens when you build a world around the management of life and death and then damage the management system without replacing it. Chapter 6. The deep places the further down you go in the lands between. The older everything gets, and the older everything gets, the less it resembles anything the Golden Order can account for. This is not an observation the game makes directly. It is something the architecture and the item descriptions and the enemy placements make together, in the aggregate, if you are paying attention to the direction things are moving. Down is old. Down is before the Erd Tree. Down is where the things that were displaced rather than destroyed ended up, where they have been existing in their specific modes of displaced existence for the duration of the Golden Order's tenure above them. The Sciofor River is the first underground area most players encounter, and it begins the vertical lore with an image that is almost beautiful before it becomes disturbing. The underground sky, the stars visible from beneath the earth, the ruins of a civilization that flourished under those stars before the Erd Tree's light reached this far. The ancestral worshippers who still gather and still practice rites that face upward toward a sky they have never seen. The beauty is real and the strangeness is real, and neither cancels the other out. Siofra is a place where something was preserved that should have been replaced, and the preservation is genuinely wondrous and genuinely wrong in roughly equal measure. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the ancestral worshippers' connection to the animals they call and the stars they face, and notice that neither of these things, animals and stars, belong to the Erdtree's cosmology in any central way. The Erdtree governs the cycle of human life. It does not speak to the relationship between humans and the natural world, and it does not distribute grace downward from the stars. The ancestral worshippers are practicing a cosmology that the Erdtree displaced without destroying. And the underground preserved it the way underground spaces tend to preserve things, not out of care, but out of obscurity. The Ainsel River carries this logic deeper into a space that is more alien than Siofra and less immediately comprehensible. The architecture is ant colony strange. The ancestral spirit presence is more attenuated. And the river itself flows towards something the game does not fully reveal. What you find in the deeper portions of the Onsel, beyond the Rot Lake and through the Noxtella ruins, is a history of a civilization that was once above ground and that was driven down by the Erdtree's expansion, not through active suppression, but through the simple social and metaphysical pressure of a new cosmology that considered them peripheral. Noxtella Eternal City is where this history becomes most explicit. The city is vast and fully formed, with its own architecture and its own aesthetic logic, its own relationship to the stars through the ceiling that opens onto a simulation of sky. The Nox people who built it were silver workers and astrologers, and the items you find there describe a culture that was specifically excluded from the Golden Order's formal structures, classified as servants of an outer god that the Two Fingers did not sanction, and managed through a combination of exclusion and periodic violent intervention. They are in the underground because the above-ground world decided it could not accommodate them. The horror here is demographic and administrative, rather than supernatural, which does not make it less disturbing. A civilization of skilled craftspeople and scholars was driven underground through the operation of a religious hierarchy that had decided they were outside the taxonomy of the properly graced. They built their cities in the dark under simulated stars, and they maintained the forms of their culture there, and they are gone now, or nearly gone, with only their constructs and their silver ores remaining as evidence of the work they did. Nokron, Eternal City, and the Siofra Aqueduct connect this history to the Night of Black Knives in a way that the game delivers almost as a footnote. The Black Knife assassins were Numen, and the shards of the Rune of Death they used were linked to Marika's own bloodline. But the network through which the assassination was planned ran through the underground cities. The excluded peoples of the lands between, the ones driven downward by the Golden Order's management of sanctity, were apparently more connected to the Night of Black Knives than the surface-level account of that event suggests. The underground was not just a storage space for the displaced. It was also where alternative political structures could develop, away from the Two Fingers' oversight. The Lake of Rot is one of the game's most purely hostile environments, an underground sea of scarlet rot that exists at the depth of the Ainsel River basin. Its horror is partly visual and partly navigational, the vast expanse of the thing, the way it extends beyond the edges of what you can see. The knowledge that the rot is spreading outward from millennia through the root system, and that this lake is one of the places it has pulled. But it is also a historical horror, because the rot that fills this space was not introduced by the Shattering. It predates the Shattering. It may predate the Golden Order. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Scarlet Rot's relationship to the outer god that afflicts millennia. And notice that the rot is described in ways that suggest it is not simply a disease, but a cosmological presence, another outer god or the tool of one, with its own agenda that operates through the spreading of the rot, rather than through directed intelligence. The rot does not want anything in the way that a person wants things. It extends. That extension, the pure directionless proliferation of something that simply grows because growing is what it does, is a different kind of horror from the kinds the game is more comfortable exploring, because it cannot be reasoned with or understood as a personality. The Deeproot Depths, visited in Chapter 2 in the context of Godwin, deserves additional attention here for its deepest reaches. Below the level where Fia waits, and where the Erd Tree's roots descend, is a space that the game's lighting and architecture treat differently from anything above it. It is older. The texture of the stone is different. The things that inhabit it are not the Erd Tree's creatures, or the Golden Order's constructs, but something from before either. Something that belongs to the stratum of the world that existed before the Greater Will arrived and began reorganizing things. The Lick Dragon Fortisax is down here, and Fortisax is one of the most conceptually complex presences in the entire game. He is one of the ancient dragons, the ones who predate the Erd Tree, and who were, in the primordial period, the dominant form of intelligence in the lands between. But Fortisax made a different choice from the other surviving dragons. He formed a friendship with Godwyn the Golden, a true friendship between a human demigod and an ancient dragon. And when Godwyn was killed on the Night of Black Knives, Fortisax descended with him, trying to fight the death that had claimed Godwyn's soul, refusing to leave. He is still there. He is still fighting the death curse in the Deathroot depths, still locked in a battle against something that claimed its victory long before you arrive. Still present in the deathbed dream where you encounter him because he has not been able to leave. The horror of Fortisax is the horror of loyalty, extended beyond its capacity to achieve anything. Of a friendship that outlasted one of its members to become a vigil, and of a vigil that has been ongoing for so long that the Vigil Keeper has become something the game classifies as a boss encounter, as an obstacle, as a thing that must be defeated rather than reached. The deepest places in the lands between are full of things that refuse to stop when stopping was indicated. The underground is not a simple archive of the displaced. It is also a record of the things that would not or could not conclude, that descended rather than ended, that found the stratum below the current world and took up residence there in lieu of accepting whatever ending would have been theirs if they had stayed above. What the deep places tell you, if you have been paying attention to all the layers above them, is that the lands between is not a world that has been damaged by the shattering. It is a world that has been accumulating damage for much longer than the shattering's timeline, that has been displacing and excluding and driving underground the things that its surface cosmology could not accommodate, and that the pressure of that displacement is now expressing itself through the fracture of the shattering's immediate aftermath. The shattering broke something that was already under stress. The deep places are where the stress had been accumulating. Chapter 7. The last things, some of the most disturbing details in Elden Ring are in the endings. Not the cutscenes, though the ending cutscenes carry their own weight, but in the ending slides, the pieces of narrated text that describe what happens to the lands between after you have made your choice. The ending slides are unusual in From Software's catalog for their specificity. They do not simply describe a changed world in impressionistic terms. They name particular things, particular characters, particular outcomes, and they describe the futures of the individuals whose stories you moved through over the course of the game, which means they are also a record of what your choices cost those individuals. The Ranni ending, which is often considered the game's best or most positive, describes a world released from the Elden Ring and the Greater Will, governed by a wisdom free from the Erd Tree's grace. Ranni ascends with the Tarnished, or uses the Tarnished, or enters a partnership with the Tarnished, whose exact nature the game leaves deliberately unclear, and departs. The lands between is left under a cold moon and a distant star, and the slide describes the age of stars as one of uncertainty and of the night sky. It is not presented as a bad ending, but it is not presented as a good one either. The certainty of the Erd Tree's grace, whatever its costs, is replaced by the uncertainty of something that has not yet made itself clear. And the people of the lands between are left to navigate that uncertainty without the guide that had been there before. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the description of the Age of Stars as beginning under the light of guidance from no particular god, And notice that this is exactly what the lands between looked like before the Greater Will introduced the Erdtree, and that the parallel is almost certainly intentional. Ranni's ending is a restoration of a kind, not to a specific prior state, but to a condition of divine absence that resembles the world before the cosmic intervention began. Whether that resemblance is hopeful or ominous depends entirely on what you believe the period before the Greater Will was actually like for the people who lived through it. The Age of Fracture, which is the default ending, is the one that requires the least and describes the most ordinary future. The Tarnished becomes Elden Lord, the Erdtree is restored, and the Golden Order continues, presumably with the modifications that the Tarnished's specific character and choices implied. The slide describes the beginning of a new age, without specifying its character, and the ambiguity is the point. An age that begins under the same cosmological structure as the age that just ended, governed by the same outer god operating through the same tree, is not obviously a new age at all. It is a restoration that leaves the underlying conditions intact. The horror in the Age of Fracture ending is not dramatic. It is procedural. The same system that produced the Shattering, that cast the Omen underground, that drove the Nox into the deep places, that broke Renala and discarded the Albinorix and chained the fire giant on the mountaintops, continues. It continues because the Tarnished, the protagonist, chose the path of least disruption, the restoration of what was, rather than the more uncertain alternatives. The game does not judge this choice, but it describes its consequences with enough specificity that the judgment is available to anyone who has been paying attention. The Frenzied Flame ending describes the burning of everything, the incineration of the Erdtree, and the spread of chaos fire through the lands between. And then, after a pause, something beginning to move again in the ash. The slide's final image, a single figure walking through a world of gray, is the most purely ambiguous image in the game's ending sequence. And it is also the most honest in a certain way. It does not promise regeneration. It does not promise that the burning was worth it. It shows you a world that has been remade at enormous cost and leaves you with a person walking into it. And the walking is all. Millicent's questline, if completed, contributes to the Age of Fracture or to the mending rune of the Erdtree path in ways that the game describes with particular care. Millicent was afflicted with the Scarlet Rot, a child of millennia in the sense of being a product of the rot spreading through human populations, rather than a literal daughter. And she carried it in a golden prosthetic arm that was the product of Gowry's work and his own particular agenda. Her questline is one of the longest and most involved in the game, and it asks you, near its end, to make a choice about whether to help her finish her journey in the way she chose, or to take from her the needle that could have helped Malenia. If you help her, Millicent's ending slide describes her disappearing into the Haligtree, spreading her needle's unalloyed gold into the rot to weaken it, her body becoming part of the tree's effort to resist the affliction. It is described as a choice she made, and as an ending that is, in some qualified way, her own. The horror of Millicent's story is not in her ending, but in its context. And the fact that she was born afflicted, that the affliction was not her fault, and that the only resolution available to her involved offering herself to the thing that produced her. She was made by the rot, and she gave herself back to fighting the rot, and the game describes this as a kind of grace, which it is, and also as the only option she had, which it also is. The Lindell Ashen Capital, which is the state of the capital if you proceed through the Frenzied Flame path, or simply burn the Erdtree before the final boss, is one of the most desolate spaces in the game. It is Lindell after the burning, a city of ash and fallen architecture, and the enemies that inhabit it are the same figures who inhabited the living city, now gray and silent and reduced. The walking mausoleums still walk. The crucible knights are still present. The city's mechanical and biological systems are still operating in the limited ways that systems operate after the energy source that powered them has been removed. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Ashen version of the capital and notice that the body of Morgoth is still there, in the same place where you fought him in the Living City, still recognizable, still present in the space he defended with everything he had. He died defending something that was going to be burned regardless of whether he defended it, because the burning was always going to be the choice of the player, or the consequence of Marika's long plan, or both simultaneously, and his defense. Whatever its intensity and its genuine devotion was always going to be insufficient. He is there in the ashes as evidence of effort that was real and outcome that was already determined. The Round Table hold is empty in the ending. The figures who gathered there, the hunters and scholars and curious wanderers who were drawn by the pull of grace towards some collective purpose, have dispersed. Their stories conclude in the ending slides, or in the penultimate moments of their quest lines, and most of them conclude in ways that are neither fully good nor fully bad, but specifically, characteristically, Elden Ring. Roderica becomes a great spirit tuner, which is the best version of the future she reached for. Nephili Loux becomes the Lord of Stormvale, which is what she wanted. Gideon Ofnir, who spent the entire game accumulating knowledge and was ultimately unwilling to let the Elden Ring be restored, because he had concluded that no Tarnished, including you, was worthy, is killed by you before the final boss. And the slide for him, if there is one, is the silence of someone who was not willing to see the thing he feared come to pass. The last things in Elden Ring are not revelations. They are confirmations. The end states of processes that the game spent 100 hours establishing. The places where the threads you have been following arrive at wherever they were always going to arrive. The horror in the endings is the horror of pattern completion, of recognizing that the shape of what happened was visible in the material from the beginning, that you were moving through a tragedy whose structure was already set before you arrived. The Tarnished is not an agent of change in the way that a hero is usually an agent of change. The Tarnished is an inheritor. You inherit a broken world, and you make a choice about what to break it into next, or how to hold the pieces together, or whether to burn everything and start from something you cannot yet name. None of the options are clean. All of them carry costs that the game will name for you in the ending slides, in the precise and unsentimental language it uses for everything that matters. The lands between does not resolve. It continues, in whichever of its possible forms your choices produced, carrying all of its accumulated history, and all of its displaced and persisting and wrongly ongoing things into whatever comes next. And whatever comes next is not shown to you, because showing you would be a comfort the material did not earn, and the game is not interested in providing comforts it has not earned. You made your choice. The world continues. The roots remember. Chapter 8. The faces of the outer gods, the greater will, is not the only cosmic intelligence with an interest in the lands between, and the game takes considerable care to never let you forget this. What is unusual about Elden Ring's treatment of divine power, compared to most games that invoke gods as narrative elements, is the consistency with which it refuses to let any of the cosmic presences become familiar. The greater will, the frenzied flame, the formless mother, the god of rot, the god of the eternal dark, all of these are presented through their effects and their intermediaries, rather than through anything like direct address, and the consistency of this choice is itself a piece of horror writing. You are living inside a contest between intelligences that cannot or will not speak to you directly, whose purposes you can only infer from the damage they have done and the servants they have shaped. The two fingers are the most visible intermediaries of the greater will, and their physical description is one of the places where the horror of the cosmic becomes most legible. They are enormous fingers, severed or otherwise detached from a body that is never shown, and they communicate through the finger readers, the old women who interpret their movements as language. The finger readers are not granted special knowledge. They read. They translate the movements of a body part belonging to a being they have never seen into instructions that have governed the political and spiritual life of the lands between for an age. The horror in this is the horror of institutional mediation, of a system in which the original source of authority is so remote that its interpreters have become, functionally, the authority. And no one can check the interpretation against anything. Another quiet detail appears when you look at Enia, the finger reader who serves the round table hold, and notice that she is genuinely uncertain about things you might expect the Two Fingers representative to know. She does not know what Marika intended. She does not know why the Elden Ring shattered in the way it did. She knows what the Two Fingers say, and she translates it faithfully, and she operates on the assumption that the Greater Will's plan is coherent and good, but the assumption is an assumption, and the game does not hide this from you. The cosmic order of the lands between is governed by an interpretation of a gesture made by a finger that belongs to something the game never shows you. The Frenzied Flame is the outer god that most directly challenges the Greater Will's claim on the world. And its mode of challenge is interesting because it does not oppose the Greater Will's values so much as it rejects the category of value entirely. The Three Fingers do not want a different kind of order. They want the dissolution of the ordering impulse itself, the erasure of all distinctions, the return of everything to an undifferentiated warmth that existed, according to the Frenzied Flame lore, before the cosmic intelligences began dividing the world into their respective categories of the sanctioned and the excluded. The Frenzied Flame is older than the Greater Will in the lands between, if the lore is read carefully. Which means it is not a new threat to an established order, but a persistent state that the established order was built to suppress. Hayeda's questline is the closest the game comes to making the Frenzied Flame's argument in full, and it is worth sitting with the argument, rather than dismissing it at the level of its conclusions. Hayeda is a woman who was blinded, whose eyes were replaced by grapes that contained the embers of the flame, who pursued this path not out of derangement, but out of a specific and considered response to what she observed about the world. Her logic is that the lands between is a world of compulsory suffering, that the structures that were supposed to ameliorate that suffering have all revealed themselves to be mechanisms for producing it more efficiently, and that the only genuinely compassionate response is the one that ends the substrate on which suffering runs. She is making a philosophical argument. The game presents it as wrong in its prescription, while never quite demonstrating that her diagnosis is incorrect. The Formless Mother is the outer god who found Mulg in the Shunning Grounds, and offered him a path out of his exclusion, and her mode of influence is the most intimate of any of the game's cosmic presences. She communicates through blood, through the warmth of maternal presence, that Moog, who was cast underground as a child and abandoned by the order he was born into, was entirely without. The horror of the Formless Mother is the horror of a cosmic intelligence that understood exactly what a person lacked and provided it as a hook. Moog's devotion to the Formless Mother is real. The blood magic he practices is real and powerful. The dynasty he tried to build was built from genuine conviction. All of this was manufactured by something that understood him well enough to give him what would turn him into a tool. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the description of the Bloodflame Blade and the other Formless Mother incantations. And notice that the blood magic is described as coming from outside the Erd Tree's grace, as an alternative channel for a different kind of divine energy. The Formless Mother is not feeding Moog corrupted grace. She is feeding him something that operates on different principles entirely. Something warm and formless and external to the system that otherwise governs power in the lands between. The horror is that this alternative was real. The system that excluded Moog was not the only possible system. There was something else out there, and it found him precisely because he was the kind of person who would respond to finding it. The God of Rot does not speak or negotiate or comfort. The God of Rot extends. The rot in Millennia's body, the rot in the Lake of Rot, the rot spreading through the Halleck Tree's fallen branches, the rot implied in the Scarlet Rot sorceries and incantations. All of this is described as the influence of a single outer god that operates not through intermediaries or through the delivery of grace, but through the proliferation of a substance that is both the god's body and its tool. The Rot is not sent by the god of Rot. The Rot is the god of Rot, or the closest thing to a body that something without stable form can maintain. Millennia carries a god inside her. It has been there since before she was born. The eternal dark that Ranni serves, or serves through the aspect of the dark moon, is the most philosophically opaque of the outer gods the game acknowledges directly. The descriptions of the eternal dark suggest a cosmic state rather than an intelligence, a condition of absence or of potential that precedes and exceeds the specific orders that have been imposed on the lands between over the centuries. Ranni's plan, which involves using the Rune of Death to separate herself from her Empyrean destiny, acquiring the Dark Moon Ring, and ascending on her own terms rather than the Greater Will's, is framed as an act of liberation. And it may genuinely be that. It is also necessarily an act of alignment with something that the game describes as void, as darkness, as the absence of the divine warmth the Erdtree's grace represents. Whether absence is better than the specific presence of the Greater Will is a question the Age of Stars ending leaves entirely open. What the Outer Gods collectively reveal, when you consider them together as a system rather than individually as sources of boss fights and item descriptions, is that the lands between is a contested territory, that the Greater Will's dominance was never a natural state, but a specific outcome of a cosmic competition that is still ongoing. The Erdtree is the Greater Will's infrastructure, in a world where other intelligences had prior or competing claims, and the shattering, whatever Marika intended by it, released the pressure that was keeping those competing claims from expressing themselves through the cracks in the Golden Order's foundations. Every outer god that has a presence in the lands between was there before or beside the Greater Will, and every one of them is still pursuing its particular agenda through whatever instruments the world provides. The horror of this is not the horror of a single enemy or a single plan. It is the horror of a world that is simultaneously a home to its inhabitants and a battlefield for intelligences that do not register the inhabitants as relevant to the competition they are engaged in. The people of the lands between live in the space between the outer gods the way people live in the space between tectonic plates, shaped by forces that are indifferent to the shapes they produce. Chapter 9. The Scholars and What They Made the Academy of Raya Lucaria is the most visible institution of secular knowledge in Elden Ring, and it is one of the game's most sustained exercises in the horror of intellectual culture applied without ethical constraint. The Academy was founded on the study of glintstone sorcery, which is described in the lore as the manipulation of the primeval current, the fundamental magical substance of the lands between, that predates the Erdtree and operates according to principles the Golden Order never fully domesticated. The scholars of Raya Lucaria were, by disposition and by charter, engaged in the study of something older and stranger than the world they lived in. And the institutional culture they developed around the study was shaped by the specific personality of intellectual work, done without adequate humility, the conviction that understanding a thing confers the right to use it. The glintstone sorceries are among the most elegant and dangerous in the game, and their item descriptions build a coherent picture of a scholarly tradition that was genuinely sophisticated about the nature of what it was studying. The scholars understood that glintstone contained something like concentrated cosmic history, fragments of a primeval state preserved in crystalline form. They understood that working with this material involved drawing on energies that were not neutral in any simple sense, that had their own character and their own tendency, that resisted the uses that were not native to them. They understood all of this, and they continued anyway, because the work was interesting, and because the institution that funded it was invested in the results. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the full moon sorceries that Rinla developed. And notice that these are described as drawing on something even further outside the glintstone tradition, on the light of a moon that the Academy's scholars associated with pure and ancient wisdom rather than with the primeval current. Renala's personal sorceries are among the most beautiful and the most alien in the game, and the lore that surrounds them suggests that she was reaching further than her colleagues into something the Academy's framework was not equipped to contain. Her madness, which followed Radagon's departure, may have been partly the consequence of contact with something that resists being touched by a person who is also managing a grief of that magnitude. The Alabaster Lords are among the Academy's more troubling experiments, and their item descriptions deserve careful reading. They are described as people who were altered through the incorporation of glintstone into their bodies, made into something partly mineral and partly human, their intelligence enhanced, and their capacity for magic deepened at the cost of whatever it was they were before the process was applied to them. The game does not tell you whether they consented. It tells you what they became, and what they became is impressive and disturbing in equal measure. Beings that walk with the specific heaviness of something in which two materials that do not belong together have been forced into proximity. The rock-sling sorcery and the stone sorceries more broadly suggest a branch of Academy research that was trying to take the mineral incorporation principle further, to work with the actual stone of the lands between as a magical medium, to understand the ground itself as a repository of the primeval current, and forms that glintstone's refinement had distilled away. The horror here is subtle. The sense of a scholarly community that kept pulling threads regardless of where the threads led, that treated the question of what something became as less interesting than the question of what it could be made into. The Azor and Lusat storylines give the Academy's overreach its most concentrated expression. Azur and Lusat were two of the Academy's most gifted scholars, both of whom pushed their research into the primeval current past the threshold of what the current does to the mind of someone who encounters it directly. They are found in the game, in states of semi-crystallization, their bodies partially converted into something between flesh and glintstone, their minds somewhere between present and absent, still capable of teaching if you approach them correctly, but not capable of explaining what happened to them. The teaching they offer, the Comet Azur incantation and the Stars of Ruin, are among the most powerful sorceries in the game, which means the damage they sustained produced results the Academy would have valued. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the founding reign of Stars sorcery, and notice that its description refers to the stars as the origin of all glintstone, as a primeval reign that crystallized into the material the Academy works with, and that this framing makes the glintstone tradition not an innovation of the Academy, but a harvesting operation, a collection and refinement of something that arrived from outside the world entirely. The scholars of Raya Lucaria were not creating new knowledge. They were processing the sediment of a cosmic event that happened before human consciousness had categories to register it with. And the processing did not make the original event comprehensible. It just made it usable. The Crystallians, which are another product of the Academy's material experiments, occupy a particularly strange position in the game's bestiary, because they are described as beings that were once human and that chose crystallization, that sought out the process of becoming mineral as an alternative to the biological mode of existence they had been assigned. The horror of the Crystallians is not that they were made into something wrong against their will. It is that they wanted this, that the Academy's culture of intellectual transgression produced individuals for whom the dissolution of the biological self into something harder and more permanent seemed like progress. They are the institution's values made flesh and then unmade into crystal. The magical prism stones and the various glintstone ores scattered through Liurnia in the Academy are at the level of game mechanics, crafting materials and light sources. At the level of lore, they are fragments of something cosmically old that the Academy taught its students to treat as resources, to pick up and use and discard without attending to whatever the fragment was before it became available for picking up. The game does not moralize about this, but it places the information in the same world as the Crystallians and Azure and Lusat and the Alabaster Lords. And the proximity of these facts is its own kind of argument about what a culture of unreflective utility produces when applied to things that resist being simply useful. Selen's questline moves through the Academy's history with the specific anger of someone who understood the institution well enough to be genuinely betrayed by it. She was one of Raya Lucaria's most talented graduates, pursued research that the Academy classified as forbidden because it accessed the primeval current in ways that broke the framework the institution had built around controlled access, and was expelled and branded for it. Her questline asks you to gather the remains of Azure and Lusat and to help her in a project to restore the primeval current to something closer to its original, unmediated form. The ending of her questline, in which her body is taken over by the assembled knowledge of her masters, and she is reduced to something less than a person, while technically winning what she was fighting for, is one of the game's most precise images of what it costs to win the wrong kind of argument with an institution. What the Academy represents, finally, is not a failure of science or scholarship in any simple sense. It represents a specific institutional failure that occurs when the culture of inquiry is more committed to the expansion of capability than to the accountability of the capable. The scholars of Raya Lucaria knew what the primeval current did to the people who accessed it directly. They taught the history of Azure and Lusat. They continued the research because the research was valuable, and because the institution's interest in valuable research consistently outweighed its interest in the welfare of the researchers producing it. Chapter 10. The weight of loyalty in the lands between is not a neutral value. Most games that invoke loyalty as a character trait treat it as straightforwardly admirable, a quality that demonstrates integrity and depth of character, something that separates the reliable from the unreliable, the true from the convenient. Elden Ring is interested in something more complicated, in what loyalty costs the loyal, and what it does to a person to devote themselves fully to a cause, or a person or an institution that is not equipped to deserve that devotion, and the specific damage that genuine faithfulness inflicts on people who apply it to objects that are not worthy of it. Bernal, Knight of the Volcano Manor, is one of the characters the game uses to examine this question, and his arc is worth following carefully because it moves through several different modes of loyalty and their respective costs. He begins, in the lore that precedes the game, as a tarnished hunter who was noted for his ferocity and his commitment to the hunt. Someone who had found in the Round Table Hold's mission a purpose adequate to his capacities. He is at the Round Table when you arrive. He is polite, informative, and clearly a person who has organized his sense of self around the function he performs. At the Volcano Manor, his loyalty has transferred to Rykard into the Manor's mission of dismantling the Golden Order through assassination. And the transfer appears clean, but the item descriptions for his equipment tell a slightly different story. Bernal did not simply switch allegiances. He escalated them, moving from a loyalty that had institutional support to one that is defined by transgression, seeking a devotion that would be harder to maintain and therefore more definitionally his own. He is looking for something to be loyal to that would test the loyalty. Another quiet detail appears when you look at his final invasion in Farum Azula and notice that he invades with a companion, that he has formed a partnership within the Manor's structure, and that the partnership is one of the details the game provides without commentary. He is not alone. He has found in the Manor's community of transgressors something that resembles what the Round Table was supposed to provide, a fellowship organized around a shared purpose. That the purpose is assassination and the dismantling of divine order makes it neither more nor less real as fellowship. And when he dies, the fellowship dies with him. And the item he drops describes someone who went looking for a worthy object of devotion and found one in a place that most would not accept as worthy. Blade the Half-Wolf is the character in Elden Ring whose arc most directly addresses the question of what loyalty costs, when the object of that devotion has a power over the loyal that was never fully disclosed. Blood was made by Ranni, created from Shadow and Wolf to serve as her protector and companion, and the love he bears for her is genuine and not, as far as the lore suggests, manufactured in the way that Miquella's followers' devotion may have been. He chose her. The choosing was real. The fact that he was made specifically with the capacity to make this choice does not obviously void the choice. His questline moves him toward a breaking point that the Two Fingers anticipated. A shadow is defined by the thing it serves, and when the thing it serves departs from the sanctioned order, the shadow becomes a liability. Blade's loyalty to Ranni outgrows the purpose he was made for, and the game describes the consequences of this with a quietness that makes the scene in the ruins of Nokron, where you find him outside his mind and have to kill him, more affecting than a more dramatic staging would have been. He is destroyed by the loyalty that defined him, not because the loyalty was wrong, but because it was larger than the container that was built for it. Millicent, already discussed in the context of the endings, is a form of loyalty study in a different register. Her loyalty is to Malenia, the mother she did not choose and does not know in any personal sense, to the origin she carries in her blood and her affliction. It is loyalty to a condition rather than to a person, devotion to something that does not know it is being devoted to, and the game's treatment of it is careful enough to present this as neither pathetic nor uncomplicated. Millicent cannot help being what she is, which is the product of the rot that Malenia carries, but she chooses what she does with that origin. The choice is her own, and the game respects it. The Crucible Knights, again, are useful here, because they represent loyalty at its most extreme and its most historically problematic. They were old before the Golden Order was conceived, devoted to the Crucible that the Golden Order later claimed to supersede. Their transition from primordial guardians to servants of the Erdtree's hierarchy is described nowhere in the game. It simply happened, the way institutional transitions happen, through the slow accumulation of new contexts and new authorities, and the gradual displacement of the old ones, and the Crucible Knights adapted without appearing to notice the displacement. They are loyal to hierarchy itself, to the form of service, in a way that makes them available to whatever hierarchy presents itself as legitimate. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Crucible Knight and Misbegotten Warrior boss encounter, and notice that these two creatures from radically different origins and with no obvious relationship are fighting side by side, sharing a boss arena in a way that suggests alliance. The Misbegotten are another excluded category, beings with beast features that the Golden Order considered unworthy of grace. In this shared fight, the institutional servant and the institutionally rejected are allied, not out of any articulated philosophy, but apparently out of the simple circumstance of both being in the same dungeon. The game does not explain the alliance. It presents it in the image of loyalty formed between the displaced and the servant who should by all rights be suppressing the displaced is quietly interesting. The Twin Knight Helm description, which describes the Twin Knights as servants who chose to be buried alive with their lord because their service did not end at the lord's death, is one of the game's most concentrated images of loyalty without limits. The Twin Knights were not commanded to die with their lord. They chose it. The armor presents this as admirable in the register of the Golden Order's values, where devotion without reservation is the highest expression of a knight's character. The game does not explicitly complicate this presentation, but it places the description in a world where the consequences of excessive devotion are visible everywhere, where loyalty that outlasts its object becomes something persistent and wrong. And the juxtaposition does the work the direct commentary does not do. Rogier's questline provides one more variation on this theme. He is a sorcerer who became obsessed with the death of Godwyn, who traced the Black Knife conspiracy with a specific intensity of someone for whom this mystery had become the organizing principle of a life that had been looking for one. His loyalty is to the truth of what happened, to an event rather than a person, and his quest line ends with him paralyzed and dying, having understood enough to know that understanding did not help and would not help, having transferred his knowledge to Fia because he recognized that someone else needed to carry it further. He dies in service to a project he initiated but could not complete, which is a kind of loyalty to an idea. And the idea was real enough to sustain the devotion even as the devotion consumed the person holding it. What the game is assembling through all of these figures is a portrait of a world in which the structures that should receive loyalty, the gods and the institutions and the orders, are not reliable objects of devotion, and in which the people who devote themselves most fully to these structures are the ones who pay the highest prices for the devotion. The lands between rewards capability and punishes fidelity. And the aggregate, and the horror of this, is not that any individual act of loyalty is wrong, but that the world is structured in such a way that genuine devotion consistently costs more than the devoted can afford. Chapter 11. The silences between the things Elden Ring does not say are sometimes more frightening than the things it does. This is a quality that belongs to a specific mode of horror writing, one that trusts the audience to feel the weight of an absence, rather than requiring the gap to be filled. From Software's games have always practiced this mode, but Elden Ring extends it further than any of the previous titles by giving you more space, more elapsed time between finding pieces of information, more requirement to hold things in mind, and let them work on you across the gaps. The silences in Elden Ring are not oversights or omissions. They are structural elements in the horror architecture, and reading them as such changes what they mean. The Night of Black Knives is the game's most significant structural silence. The assassination of Godwyn, the theft of the Rune of Death, the political consequences that followed, and that led eventually to the Shattering. All of this is an event that the game returns to from multiple angles across the entire runtime, without ever presenting it directly. You learn about it from the Black Knife armor's item description, from the curse mark of death, from Fia's questline, from the architecture of the Hallowhorn grounds, from the words of Roderica in D and Roger in Enya, from the existence of the Black Knives themselves scattered through the game as enemies. You learn about it from its aftermath rather than from the event itself. This has an effect on how the Night of Black Knives feels in the imagination. An event you reconstruct from its consequences has a different emotional weight than an event you witness or are told about directly. You assemble the night from fragments, and the assembly process is active rather than passive, which means that when you finally have something like a picture of what happened, the picture has been built by your own attention and your own inference, and it carries the weight of that construction. The horror is collaborative in a way that passively received horror is not. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the timing of the Night of Black Knives, which the lore establishes as occurring shortly after the marriage of Radagon and Marika's merging. And notice that this timing suggests a political landscape in which several groups had reason to act simultaneously. The Black Knife assassins were Newman. The Rune of Death was linked to Marika's bloodline. The target was Godwyn, the most beloved of the demigods and the one whose death would cause the most disruption without immediately destabilizing any single faction's power. The coordination implied by this event is never made explicit. The game does not show you the meeting where the plan was made. It shows you the outcome and trusts you to hear the planning and the silence around it. The pre-shattering period is another large structural silence that the game constructs carefully. You know the Golden Order existed and functioned for an extended period before the Shattering. You know the demigods were alive and present during this period. You know that relationships formed and conflicts developed, and that the specific tensions that expressed themselves through the Shattering had antecedents. But the game gives you almost nothing of this period directly. What came before the catastrophe is reconstructed entirely from the debris of the catastrophe itself. and the debris is not evenly distributed. What this means is that the golden age of the Golden Order, if there was one, exists in the game only as a negative space, as the implied alternative to the ruined and contested world you actually move through. Every item description that tells you what something was before the shattering is, implicitly, also telling you about a world you never see and cannot know except through the specific filter of what survived the break. The silence about the pre-shattering world is the loudest silence in the game, because everything you find is a remnant of something that silence contains. The question of what Marika actually wanted is a silence the game approaches from every direction without ever filling. She destroyed the Elden Ring. This is established fact. Her reasons are not. The item descriptions and NPC dialogue that address her motivations are consistently hedged, consistently speculative, consistently arriving at possibilities rather than conclusions. Inaya does not know. Ranni, who is positioned as knowing more about the cosmic situation than almost anyone else in the game, still frames Marika's intentions as uncertain. The Two Fingers do not know, or if they do not say. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Two Fingers themselves and notice that their communication is nonverbal, that the language of the fingers is movement and gesture interpreted by readers, and that this mode of communication makes the question of what they actually know, as opposed to what their gestures are interpreted to mean, permanently inaccessible. The fingers do not speak. They are read. And the gap between speaking and being read is a gap through which a significant amount of what might otherwise be knowable has disappeared. The prehistory of the Nox and the Eternal Cities is another silence that rewards the patience you bring to it. The Nox were above ground once. The lore establishes this. They were driven underground. And the specifics of when and how and over what exact period are not given. You reconstruct the timeline from the architecture and the items and the enemy placements, and the geography of the Ainsel River and Siofra and Nokron and Noxtella, and the reconstruction gives you something like a history, but a history with gaps that the game does not fill, and that your inference is not quite close. The silence around Radagon's nature is sustained with particular care. The revelation that Radagon is Marika, or that they share a body, or that the relationship between them is something for which the game's vocabulary is not quite adequate, arrives through item descriptions and through the final boss's lore, rather than through any direct statement. Characters in the game speak of Radagon as separate from Marika. The lore treats them as separate. The game's mechanics treat the Elden Beast and Radagon as two parts of the same encounter, which is its own kind of statement. But what the merging of Marika and Radagon actually was, cosmologically, remains a silence the game fills with the fact of their shared body without explaining the fact. What does it mean that the god of the lands between and the man who left Rennala to return to that god are the same entity? The question is enormous, and the game presents it and does not answer it, and the not answering is part of what makes it enormous. Rennala loved Radagon. Radagon was Marika, the god who shaped the world that Rennala was absorbed into and then discarded by, was the same being as the person Rennala loved. The recursion of this is disturbing in ways that take time to fully register. In the silence the game maintains about it, the way it presents the fact and retreats from the implication is what gives the implication its weight. The silences in Elden Ring are not comfortable silences. They are not the silences of a story that ran out of material or could not figure out how to address a complication it had introduced. They are the silences of a story that understands exactly what it is not saying and has made the choice to let the unsaid speak for itself, trusting that the person who has come this far is capable of hearing what is not said and finding in it something more frightening than a full articulation would have been. Chapter 12. The Ones Who Chose This There is a category of disturbing presence in Elden Ring that is neither the victim of circumstance nor the product of cosmic indifference, but something that understood its situation and made a specific, considered choice about how to inhabit it. These are the characters who looked at the options available to them in the lands between and chose the most extreme one, not from madness or compulsion or corruption in any simple sense, but from a logic that the game presents carefully enough that the logic remains legible even as the choice remains disturbing. The horror of deliberate choice is different from the horror of circumstance, and Elden Ring is more interested in it than almost any other game in this genre. Fia, the deathbed companion, made a choice. The game establishes this with enough detail that the choice cannot be dismissed as simply a corruption or a possession. She was a healer by practice, someone who had observed the specific suffering produced by the Erd Tree's management of death. The way that undeath under the Golden Order's system was not rest, but a sustained mode of diminished existence. And she had concluded that the removal of true death from the world was the foundational wrong from which all the other wrongs descended. She chose to act on this conclusion, to carry the rune of death in her body, because her body had the specific quality of warmth and connection that could hold it without destroying itself, and to deliver it to the place where it could be restored to the world. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the embrace Fia offers at the round table, and notice that the game gives you the option to refuse it, and that refusing it has no practical consequence, but registers as a choice. The embrace depletes your maximum health slightly, and the game makes this a mechanical fact, a measurable cost to the comfort Fia offers. The relationship between the cost of comfort and the reality of what Fia is carrying is not spelled out. It is simply present in the mechanics, and the presence of the cost makes the comfort more real rather than less, because things that cost something are not the same as things that do not. Gideon Ofnir, the All-Knowing, is perhaps the game's most precise image of a person who chose a specific mode of failure. He is an intelligence operative at the Round Table, someone who has spent his life accumulating knowledge about the lands between and its powers, and the accumulation has become its own trap. He knows too much to believe that any Tarnished, including himself, is genuinely capable of becoming Elden Lord in any meaningful sense. He has seen too clearly what the Golden Order is, and what it costs, and what the alternatives cost. His response to this knowledge is to become an obstacle to the endings he cannot endorse, to stand between you and the final boss not as a villain but as someone who has concluded that the thing you are about to attempt is a mistake, and who has the capability, barely, to attempt to stop it. He is wrong, in the sense that his interference fails. He may not be wrong in any other sense, and the game is not confident enough in the correctness of what happens after you defeat him to present his position as simply mistaken. He gathered knowledge, and the knowledge produced paralysis. And paralysis at the threshold of action is one of the game's most carefully drawn failure modes, because it is the failure mode of intelligence rather than of weakness or corruption. He knew too much and did too little with it, and the choice to know more rather than to act earlier is the choice that defined him. Millicent's choice to face the Scarlet Rot rather than to let it consume her is discussed in the chapter on endings, but it deserves additional consideration here as a choice rather than as an outcome. She could not have not been born carrying the rot. She could not have chosen a different origin, but she could have chosen, and the game presents characters who do choose, to simply submit to the affliction, to let the rot progress and spread and transform without resistance. She did not. The resistance is not framed as heroism in any grandiose sense. It is framed as preference, as the specific quality of a person who encountered what she had been given and chose to spend her life at an angle to it, rather than parallel. Another quiet detail appears when you look at her prosthetic arm, which was made from the unalloyed gold that Miquella developed. And notice that this material is one of the few things in the lands between that can neutralize the influence of an outer god. Millicent is carrying in her body the instrument that could theoretically remove the thing that is killing her, and she does not use it on herself, because using it on herself would mean withdrawing from the fight that she has decided to spend her life inside. The weapon against the thing that afflicts her is deployed against the affliction rather than in service of her personal survival. And this is a choice rather than an oversight. And the choice is deeply characteristic of the specific kind of person she is. Patches occupies a different position in this category because his choices are consistently in service of his own survival and comfort. And the game presents his survival and comfort as genuinely valuable rather than as the small and shabby things that some narratives would make of them. Patches is afraid of dying. He is afraid in a very ordinary and non-heroic way, and his response to this fear is to become very good at ensuring that other people take the risks he wants to avoid. He is not pretending to a devotion he does not feel. He is clear-eyed about what he wants, which is to live, and he has organized his entire existence around the efficient pursuit of this goal. The horror in Patches, if it can be called that, is the horror of recognizing his logic as coherent, of understanding that the world of the lands between actually does distribute death very unevenly, and that the people who survive it tend to be the people who have specific skills for not being the one who dies. Patches has developed these skills with the same dedication that Bernal developed his combat skills, and the result is a person who is alive when most people around him are not, and who has no particular guilt about this outcome. The game does not punish him for this. He survives most of the quest lines that involve him. The choice to prioritize his own continuation over any of the larger projects the game asks you to care about is, in the Lands Between's moral accounting, not the wrong choice. The merchant Kale, the first merchant most players encounter, carries a questline hook that most players miss because it is distributed so thinly across the game. His family is dead. He travels and sells things, and offers the kind of cheerful professional affect that merchants in these games tend to have. And underneath the affect is someone who has lost everything that the trading is not a replacement for, and who has made the choice to keep trading because trading is what he can do, and doing what you can do is sometimes all the choice that remains. His is not a horror story. It is a grief story, and grief is sometimes the structure underneath the horror, rather than the horror itself. What the deliberate choices in Elden Ring collectively suggest is a world in which the options are never good, but the choosing still matters. In which the difference between Fia and Gideon and Millicent and Patches is not the difference between right and wrong, but the difference between characters whose choices fit them, and characters whose choices are too large or too small for the people making them. The Lands Between does not offer good options. It offers options. And what you do with options is a question about character, not about strategy. Chapter 13. The architecture of dread, the spaces of Elden Ring are built with the same care as the lore, and the two systems of meaning reinforce each other in ways that are worth examining directly. From Software's architectural design has always been a form of environmental storytelling, but Elden Ring extends this practice into areas that the previous games were less systematically interested in, using the geometry and the atmosphere and the enemy placement and the acoustic design of spaces to build something that functions as an argument about what the space is and what happened in it, with or without the supporting item descriptions. Farum Azula is the most structurally ambitious space in the game from this perspective, because it is trying to convey through architecture alone a cosmological concept that the item descriptions then confirm and extend. The city is fragmenting. The pieces of it are in the process of separating from each other, drifting apart in a storm that has been ongoing for so long that the storm seems like the natural state of things, rather than an intrusion on a prior stillness. Moving through Farum Azula requires crossing gaps, navigating around absences, using the remains of structures that are no longer connected to each other in the ways they were originally designed to be. The city is demonstrating its own condition through the demands it makes on the player's movement. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the music that accompanies Farum Azula, and notice that it is scored differently from almost anywhere else in the game, with a specific quality of suspension, of something that is neither resolved nor progressing, that mirrors the visual language of the space. The storm is always there. The music is always in the same mode. The beastmen are always practicing the same rites. Everything in Farum Azula is in a continuous present tense that has been ongoing since before the Erdtree, and the architecture is built to communicate the oppressive quality of an eternal present more effectively than any description could. Stormveil Castle is built according to the logic of a fortification that has been contested for a long time, and the specifics of its construction communicate a history of siege and counter-siege that the item descriptions confirm. The ramparts have been breached. The defenses have been reinforced after breaching. The castle has been occupied by forces whose relationship to the original inhabitants is visible in the way the new inhabitants have arranged themselves around the old ones. And the spaces where Godric's grafted experiments have been stationed beside the original castle guard, and the evidence of a siege that was successful and an occupation that is still being organized. The horror of Stormveil is the horror of a space that has been used for multiple things by multiple people over time, and that carries the evidence of each use in its walls and its floors and its enemy distribution, without providing a clean narrative that would allow you to understand what happened here and the order in which it happened. You move through the consequences of a conflict the game does not show you directly, and the architecture of the consequences is more disturbing than a direct account would have been. Caelid is the game's most immediately legible horror environment, the place where the visual language of the Scarlet Rot is most fully deployed across a landscape. And its legibility is worth examining because it represents a different strategy from the game's usual approach. Caelid does not require you to supply the emotional weight. It asserts it through the red sky and the transformed animals, and the bodies and the rot bubbles, and the specific wrongness of the flora that has been converted into something that used to be alive in a different mode. Caelid is horror at the level of surface rather than depth, which means it is effective immediately and in ways that do not accumulate or deepen significantly with additional attention. That said, there is a deeper Caelid underneath the visual horror, accessible through the item descriptions that describe the region before the rot, through the Celia questline, through the Redmane Castle lore that describes a place that was a functioning noble estate before it became an outpost in a blighted landscape. The Caelid that exists before the rot is not given to you directly, but it is reconstructible from the ruins and the descriptions and the specific things that survived the rot because of their material or their placement. And the reconstruction gives you a sense of what was lost that the visual horror alone does not supply. The subterranean shunning grounds is the game's most deliberately unpleasant space at the level of design, and the unpleasantness is functional rather than simply oppressive. The sewer architecture communicates the social position of the people who live here, the omen, the excluded bodies. The things the city above decided it could not accommodate without becoming something other than itself. The underground is not a dungeon in the sense of a place where enemies are stored for combat. It is a residence, built by its inhabitants from what was available to them, made livable in ways that the game carefully describes through the arrangement of the space and the items you find within it. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the path to the Frenzied Flame prescription, and notice that it requires descending through layers of the shunning grounds that become progressively less architecturally coherent, as if the city's logic thins as you move further from it, until you arrive at a space that is defined by the absence of the city's logic, rather than by any alternative logic of its own. The door to the Three Fingers is at the bottom of a long drop through spaces that were not designed for habitation, and the design of those spaces communicates something about the relationship between the Three Fingers and the city above that no item description explicitly states. The thing underneath is what the city was built on top of. Not in the geological sense, but in the sense that the city's specific arrangements exist partly in order to prevent what is underneath from rising. Lindell itself is the game's most sustained exercise in architectural horror of the more subtle kind, because it is a city that looks, on the surface, like the game's most fully realized expression of divine order and political achievement. And that reveals itself through the accumulation of attention as a city built on exclusion, empowered by a hierarchy that its most impressive visual elements exist to justify. The fortified manor, the avenue balcony, the Erd Tree Sanctuary, all of these spaces communicate the achievement of the Golden Order with genuine power. They are beautiful in the way that achievement built on suppressed cost tends to be beautiful, which is to say completely, in a way that requires active work to see through. The Erd Tree itself, when you finally approach it in Lindell, is architecturally interesting, because it is both the most prominent structure in the game's visual vocabulary, and also fundamentally inaccessible. You approach it through everything the game throws at you, and when you arrive at a door you cannot open, a barrier that the Erd Tree itself has erected against entrance. The most sacred site in the lands between is also the most defended, and the defense is interior, coming from the tree rather than from any external guardian. The Erd Tree does not want you inside it, and the architecture of its approach is designed to communicate the enormity of this rejection. The consecrated snowfield, which is the game's final above-ground region before Halictree and the mountaintop of the giants, communicates something through its weather that is more than purely atmospheric. The blizzard that makes navigation of the snowfield difficult does not prevent movement, but it prevents orientation, removes the visual context that would allow you to know where you are in relation to everything else. Moving through the snowfield is moving through a space that has deliberately obscured its own geography. That has made itself incomprehensible to the navigational tools you have developed for the rest of the game. And the incomprehensibility is not accidental. The things hidden in the snowfield, the Ordina liturgical town, the approach to the Halictree, the grave that holds the other half of the Halictree medallion, are things that were meant to be found only by people who are willing to be lost first. Architecture in Elden Ring is not decoration. It is argument. And the argument it is making is about the relationship between what a space looks like and what the space was built to do, between the surfaces a culture presents and the systems those surfaces exist to represent or conceal. Every dungeon is a claim about something, and every castle and city and ruin and underground cavern is making a specific argument about the people who built it, and what they built it for, and what it cost them, and whether the thing it was built for was worth the cost. The game trusts you to hear these arguments without having them translated into exposition, and the trust is part of what makes the architecture disturbing in the way that it is. Chapter 14, The Question of Mequella, is probably the most important figure in Elden Ring who is never fully present in the game, and the partial visibility of his presence is one of the most sustained pieces of horror construction in the entire work.